Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm joined again by Aaron Bastani. Aaron, how are you doing? Have you had a nice weekend? Oh, where are you? What's this background? This is new.
I'm at home, Michael. I'm in what it will be one day my study. But it's not there yet, sadly. But the desk is there. It's just the rest of the room. But no, I had a very nice weekend, and apologies to our listeners and viewers again tonight for my mic. I'm talking into a very good phone, but it's still a phone. It'll be rectified the next time I'm speaking to you down the line, Michael.
That's a promise. Coming up tonight, an interview with Ines Schwerdtner, the co-leader of the German Socialist Party, Die Linke. Israel is once again preventing aid from entering Gaza, and No Other Land, filmed in the West Bank, wins Best Documentary at the Oscars. We look at their speeches. Stay tuned for all of that. As ever, make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube chat, or you can tweet us on the hashtag Novara Live. Straight into our first story, though. After the epic fallout between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky on Friday, Keir Starmer has stepped up to play leader of the free world. On Sunday, he gave a big interview to Laura Kuhnsberg.
I do think that generally Europe needs to do more in its own defence and security, and that's why I've said we need to increase spending, we've got to increase capability, and we've got to coordinate more, because in the Ukraine conflict we've seen that the coordination isn't there. I think then on top of that, we need to be clear what a European security guarantee would look like. I do acknowledge, as you put this to me, that that's more likely to be in the first instance, a coalition of the willing. In other words, we've got to find those countries in Europe that are prepared to be a bit more forward-leaning.
Now, the idea of a coalition of the willing might bring up bad memories. It was the phrase, of course, used by George W. Bush in the run-up to the disastrous war in Iraq. The players this time, though, are quite different. Back in 2003, the US were in and France was out. This time, it's the other way around. Macron has been Starmer's key ally in trying to craft a European response to a shift in policy from the White House. Macron was among 18 other leaders welcomed to London yesterday in an emergency security summit hosted by the Prime Minister. So what came out of that meeting? Well, the rhetoric surrounding European defence continued to get tougher. This was European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
It's basically turning Ukraine into a steeled porcupine that is indigestible for potential invaders. And therefore the focus is not only on the military supply, but also, for example, securing their energy system and making sure that over time this is a strong and resilient country.
Have you won the argument with European colleagues about stepping up to the plate in terms
Absolutely.
of money?
We all have understood that after a long time of underinvestment, it is now of utmost importance to step up the defence investment for a prolonged period of time.
Europe's steel porcupine. I'm not sure if that will be going up on the Tourist Board website. In any case, Keir Starmer elaborated on how the UK would be adding to Ukraine's proverbial spikes.
Those willing will intensify planning now with real urgency. The UK is prepared to back this with boots on the ground and planes in the air, together with others. Europe must do the heavy lifting. But to support peace in our continent and to succeed, this effort must have strong US backing. Today, I'm announcing a new deal which allows Ukraine to use £1.6 billion of UK export finance to buy more than 5,000 air defence missiles, which will be made in Belfast, creating jobs in our brilliant defence sector.
So get used to hearing boots on the ground and planes in the air. Keir Starmer has been saying it over and over again, including in Parliament today. And in every interview he's done, Starmer has tried to position himself as a potential bridge between Trump and Zelensky, and between Europe and the United States. He's won massive plaudits among the commentariat for the speed at which he's got other world leaders on side. However, even with his so-called coalition of the willing, or within his so-called coalition of the willing, there are already signs of discord. This morning, the French foreign minister proposed a 1-month partial ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. The idea from the French is for a time-limited ceasefire applying to the air, sea, and energy infrastructure while negotiations get underway. It would not limit fighting between ground troops. However, the UK has already distanced itself from those plans. a British official told the Financial Times, quote, "There are various options on the table subject to further discussions with the US and European partners, but a 1-month truce has not been agreed." Arms Forces Minister Luke Pollard said on Sky the danger with a short deal or a short-term truce would be if it allowed Putin time to strengthen the Russian army in the meantime. And meanwhile, in the Commons today, Keir Starmer warned against Ukraine signing another weak deal like Minsk. And he also said this.
We must proceed with strength, and that does now require urgently a coalition of the willing. Mr. Speaker, we agreed on Sunday that those willing to play a role in this will intensify planning now. And as this House would expect, Britain will play a leading role with, if necessary, and together with others, boots on the ground and planes in the air. Mr. Speaker, it is right that Europe do the heavy lifting to support peace on our continent. But to succeed, this effort must also have strong US backing. I want to assure this House I take none of this lightly. I've visited British troops in Estonia, and no aspect of my role weighs more heavily than the deployment of British troops in the service of defence and security in Europe. And yet I do feel very strongly that the future of Ukraine is vital for our national security. Russia is a menace in our waters and skies. They've launched cyber attacks on our NHS, assassination attempts in our streets. In this House, we stand by Ukraine because it's the right thing to do. But we also stand by them because it's in our interest to do so.
I don't know, listening to that, Aaron, it was just giving Tony Blair, right? I mean, my concern here, my worry, is that Keir Starmer is enjoying this a bit too much. He's had a difficult time as Prime Minister. He's been fairly unpopular. And now he's talking about troops on the ground, planes in the sky. Suddenly, everyone in the media is saying, Keir Starmer, this is really him rising to his moment. He's doing brilliantly here. And yeah, I mean, Macron as well. These are two leaders with very, very low approval ratings who are now very enthusiastically taking a lead when it comes to, being quite forthright when it comes to the prospects of war.
Concerning, isn't it, Michael? I did watch that Commons exchange, and actually I would, of course, because we're covering it tonight on tonight's show. I wouldn't black my way through. I watched most of it. I'm really worried, Michael. There was one Tory MP who referred to Kaiser Wilhelm II underestimating the British Army before the First World War. He subsequently said, "We can give as good as we get." Now, these might be considered throwaway lines, but this is really important. We're now entering a sustained standoff with a nuclear-armed power, and a senior member of parliament is using historical analogous thinking and referring to the lead up to the First World War. It's not an accident, because actually we're in quite a similar situation. And I don't say that lightly. And listening to today's debate, Michael, like I say, I was very worried, I was very concerned. The simple reason being that everybody agrees with Keir Starmer. Everybody agrees with Keir Starmer. Very few dissenting voices. You had some questions in regards to the details and specifics. One was from Nigel Farage about how many British soldiers would be committed to Ukraine. Just being booed isn't the right word, he wasn't booed, but he was being sort of, jeered by Labour MPs. That's a really important question. I don't care who asks it. I don't care if Satan asks it. It's a hugely important question. Will UK soldiers be going there? Yes. Okay. What's the timeline? How many? Richard Bergen asked a similar question, adding, will we have a parliamentary vote? You could almost hear people go, oh God, not again. A parliamentary vote about whether or not British soldiers go to Ukraine, which, by the way, Russian voices are on record as saying they would consider the British and French being in Ukraine as an army of occupation. This is a really important thing to discuss and debate as a society, and people asking really important questions are, if not being smeared, are being stigmatized. And it's a real problem. The whole strength of democracy, Michael, is that you have dissenting voices. Even if they're in a minority, it means that people defending a majority position have to actually make explicit justifications, have to show they're working. Keir Starmer didn't do that in response to the questions from either Richard Bergen or from Nigel Farage. He said, in response to Farage's question, like I say, he evaded any actual answer, that we shouldn't be sort of, overly friendly with Russia, implying that Farage is and has been, obviously has been, but I think the question still merits being answered. And then in regards to Bergen, he said something slightly similar and not as aggressive. He did say that there would be a parliamentary vote, but that's a long way away. Interesting if he'll be held to that. Of course, we know with Keir Starmer, he has a record of saying things which are convenient in the short term, and of course, in the long term, he dispenses with them. But I get really worried, Michael, because time after time after time, experience tells us, I'm old now, I'm 41, experience tells us when you have that much consensus at Westminster, when everybody agrees on something, when everybody is complimenting the Prime Minister, it generally means bad news is coming. And we saw similar takes immediately following Suez, immediately following 9/11, immediately following the fall of Saddam in Iraq. You had our domestic media class saying this is fantastic, there are no downsides, nothing can go wrong. The doomsayers have been proven to be outright talking nonsense. And even with regards to Suez in the early stages, you had the media at the time, this of course in the mid-1950s, with the Suez Canal, British and the French effectively tried to, ensure they maintain control of the strategically important choke point in the global economy. You had the British media saying, well, domestically, Anthony Eden isn't doing very well, but this is great because it allows him to pivot into foreign policy. They said the exact same thing about Anthony Eden. So that's my worry, Michael. You hear the voices, you hear the consent, you see the media response. Any kind of experience sort of indicates this can get very, very sour very quickly.
I want to there's a couple of comments, and because we got some of these on Friday as well, and I they're definitely worth reading out. Harabe, I hope I pronounced your name right, Sancho. As a leftist from Eastern Europe, I must say it's extremely frustrating to see this approach to Ukraine from Western leftists. Someone else sort of saying, well, can you explain Novara's approach to this? Novara doesn't have an approach. We're a pluralist organization. Where I'm coming from with this, when there is an unpopular leader who has found an issue where they can finally get journalists to write nice things about them and finally get the opposition to say nice things about them and sort of look prime ministerial, let's say, and when the stakes are actually quite high, that always unnerves me. It unnerves me when sort of questioning a policy is seen as traitorous or gets you called a Putin stooge, which is happening to people sort of suggesting that boots on the ground and planes in the sky isn't a good idea. When it actually comes to what should happen to Ukraine, right? Because that does matter. This is something I've been sort of struggling with. I'm like, I can absolutely see why Ukraine wants security guarantees and why they would want, troops on the ground and planes in the sky. I have to say, the first article I read, that really I sort of read it and I was like, okay, that makes so much sense. It was today. I'm going to try and get him on the show later in the week by someone called Stephen Wertheim. He's from the Carnegie sort of Institute of Peace or something like that. And he's saying, is Europe misunderstanding Trump's position on Ukraine? And what he's saying is that Trump's position on Ukraine, whether or not you like the guy, he's actually being quite clear, which is he's saying, we don't want to be in a situation where if Russia invades Ukraine again, we are immediately brought into a conflict with Russia, right? Which is what, these peacekeeping forces, when you say a peacekeeping force, when the UN does a peacekeeping force, let's say, normally you've got, two fairly weak sides. So this might be in a sort of poorer country where you've got two sides in a civil war or something like that. And then the troops who are coming in are just overwhelmingly more powerful than them, which means that they can sort of keep the peace. If you had British troops in Ukraine, they would be a deterrent force, right? Russia isn't necessarily going to be terrified of them, but Russia has to make a decision. It will make Russia more reluctant to sort of try and push forward their lines, but they're not necessarily going to be terrified of doing that, right? Because also they'll think that maybe if we give that a go, the Brits might go back to Poland. Maybe they'll fight a war with us. The stakes are immediately raised. Anyway, what this guy was saying in The Guardian is that what could work as a compromise, the Europeans seem to be trying to sort of beg Trump to give assurances which he doesn't want to give, potentially sort of air power, sort of planes in the sky. Keir Starmer saying the Brits will do it. I don't think the Brits think they can do it alone. That's why they keep saying the Americans should backstop it. This guy is suggesting that what could work is we all say, look, if we have peacekeepers in Ukraine, that's essentially the same as letting Ukraine in NATO, right? You're putting the front line there. You're saying that if Russia were to try something again in Ukraine, we're immediately at war with Russia, which is massively raising the stakes. I always say, Russia illegally invaded Ukraine. They shouldn't have done that. It's an outrage. Ukrainians have every right to feel absolutely aggrieved. But also, Western leaders have a responsibility to try and de-escalate so that we don't get to something that looks like World War III. What this guy was saying as a potential option is you have a peace deal where the security guarantee isn't Western troops, isn't something that would bring the West into an immediate war with Russia, but to say, we will really continue to keep arming Ukraine, even in peacetime, so that it is going to be... So I suppose to use Ursula von der Leyen's sort of phrases, there's still a spiky steel porcupine. And he was suggesting that also you could put in any kind of peace deal, that if Russia were to try anything again, the West would immediately guarantee shed loads of weapons to Ukraine. Potentially they could already stockpile them beforehand. So there are ways. I mean, what I've been sort of struggling with is I can see why Ukraine wants some kind of assurances to deter Russia. I also, am uncomfortable putting British troops on a front line with Russia and where there's an active conflict because it seems like the possibility of de-escalation is huge. And I do think there is probably some kind of smart way where we can achieve both of those things. At the moment, I feel like Keir Starmer has, focus grouped the idea of saying troops on the ground, planes in the sky, and it's focus grouped well. And he's getting everyone in the commentariat giving him these big claps. And so he's like, well, let's go for that then. What's happened to Ukraine is absolutely awful. But I do feel like this inflation of the threat of Russia to us, yes, I think it would be very difficult to inflate the threat of Russia to Ukraine, right? Russia wants to destroy Ukraine as an independent nation. Like the reason I think probably we should, massively arm Ukraine even after a peace deal is because I want them to be able to exist as an independent nation, right? They're not going to get all their territory back, but if they can be a successful nation within the territory they keep, look at, say, South Korea and North Korea or something. South Korea was an independent, successful nation, even with a sort of frozen armistice. If Ukraine could manage that, that would be brilliant. But whatever happens here, the idea that sort of Russia is a threat to, your average person walking down a British street, that is just inflating the threat beyond where it is. And that to me will lead to bad policy. Like, let's be honest, let's be realistic when we're talking about this. Let's not be polemical when we're talking about war and peace.
Yeah, because I think we're being primed for a conflict, Michael. I think that's what's happening. People can be critical of what we're saying, but these are the facts. If British and French soldiers go into Ukraine, which, as I've already said, the Russians have said they would consider that an army of occupation, but fine, they've said lots of things which haven't turned out to be in any way meaningful. What do you then think happens? We've had years, rightly, by the way, of people saying that the Russians are experts at hybrid warfare, that actually they use irregular forces, and often it's Spetsnaz, it's Russian armed forces, posing as, Ukrainian patriots. Why wouldn't that happen here? Why wouldn't there be IEDs, exploding under British convoys, vehicles? Not by the Russians. Vladimir Putin isn't going to go on TV and say, it's me, Gov. They'll say it's Ukrainian patriots. People taking a pop at UK soldiers, at French soldiers. That is what would likely happen. That would be the escalation. So my simple question to people watching and listening is, what is the escalation strategy from the French and the British? That's it. I don't want this to be a moral, he's a good guy, he's a bad guy. That is a very dangerous path to go down. Please think analytically. What is the escalation strategy? And if it does mean a conflict between the French, the British, the rest of Europe, and the Russians, can we win? Now, if you think we definitely can win, and there won't be massive costs across Europe, fine. You can think that. I don't think that. I live in Portsmouth on the south coast of England, it's the home of the Royal Navy. If there is a major conflict between the countries of Europe and Russia, it's very likely that ICBMs would be sent to cities like this. It's very likely. Not a major city, but a significant military target. That is quite likely if you start talking about the possibility of conventional war, by the way. Conventional war. Let's park the nuclear thing. Just conventional war. That becomes very likely. So what's the strategy? That's the simple question I'm posing. What's the strategy? What's the escalation strategy? What is it? Even now, hearing Starmer in Parliament earlier on today, he said we'll have to have the US backstop. Well, are you listening to what the White House is saying? They don't want to be militarily involved in Ukraine. That's what they've said. They want the Europeans to sort this out. Which also goes to another point. I keep on seeing people on social media saying, well, look, Starmer's played a blinder. There's King Charles. Trump must be outraged. No, this is explicitly what Trump and Rubio and J.D. Vance have asked for, which is for the Europeans to take care of European affairs. Now, you can agree with them. You can say this is really important. They should do. They should, to some extent, remilitarize, etc., etc. We can have that conversation. That's not going to work overnight. Russia has been remilitarizing, building up its military-industrial complex for a decade before this war even started. Britain, France, other European countries haven't. So it goes back to my question. If you think it's perfectly legitimate that there should be some kind of conflict between France and Britain and the rest of Europe and Russia as part of your escalation strategy, how certain are you that we can win? I'm not particularly certain. And so I do see us being here on the path to really bad decisions. And again, people thinking emotionally. They said after Maidan, oh, well, Ukraine should just join NATO. So what? Screw what the Russians think. I agree. I believe in the right of every nation, every people to national self-determination. By the way, I agree with your point about Ukraine having the means to at least defend some kind of border, even if there is a partition, like the Koreas. I believe in the right to self-determination. But the reality is, if you want the conversation to be Ukraine's joining NATO, and you have a psychopath like Vladimir Putin, and by the way, he's not alone. He represents and reflects a serious body of public opinion in Russian civil society, particularly at an elite level. Just look at the conversations and the debates in the Russian Duma. Then you will invite this kind of thing. And if you said 4, 5, 6 years ago, well, I think actually Ukraine shouldn't join NATO, it should be a neutral country. I personally think that. I think because of geography, places like Georgia, places like Ukraine should just be neutral, personally. Well, oh my God, Aaron, they have a right to self-determination. Well, okay, then we have the possibility of a war involving France, the UK and Russia. And 500,000 people have died on each side. That's what's happened. I'm not saying that Putin's gone on there just because of that. It's also because, of course, he's an irredentist. He's a Russian ultranationalist. He believes this is all part of Russia. But this is where we're going to end up then. This is where we're going to end up. If you're not willing to be comfortable with the political reality of the situation. And the political reality right now is that people are inviting a situation where Britain and France are in an armed conflict with Russia when, simply put, they are not in a situation where they can win, where they are not in a situation where they are politically, militarily, economically prepared. I mean, today we saw the bond markets, Michael. It's only 1 day's data, but you saw a significant increase in UK gilts because bond markets look at the UK, they look at the fundamentals, they say 10% of government spending is going on servicing their debt. They've got zero growth. They've had zero productivity growth for 18 years. And now they want to increase defense spending from 2% to 3% quite quickly. That doesn't seem like a viable situation. Now, Keir Starmer says the first responsibility of my government is to ensure national security, national self-defense. Of course, it's also your responsibility not to have a debt crisis, because if you do, you can't do any of that stuff. These are the realities. And I don't really care about the emotional sort of tone of the situation. In fact, the more that politicians play to people's heartstrings, the more concerned I am. Because it's precisely at these moments we need analytical, precise, cold, clear thinking.
Someone's asked in the comments, what would you have in lieu of a security guarantee? You sort of, I suppose the position I'm leaning towards is we should not have troops on the ground and planes in the sky, but we should offer, shed loads of military equipment, not to continue this war. I think we should bring this war to an end, but agree to transfer lots of military equipment to Ukraine so that they can defend themselves if Russia were to try again.
Well, we've not had a proper effort at a peace negotiation. I mean, it would be quite interesting if there was just an open conversation and people said to Vladimir Putin, put the bullshit aside, what are your maximalist objectives here? I presume, personally, it's something like most of Ukraine. Presumably all the south, Odessa, probably up to the river Dnipro, maybe even Kyiv, right? Actually, Ukraine's capital is now Lviv in the in the west of the country. I think that's probably his maximalist agenda. Maybe it's even more than that. So I'm not naive to Vladimir Putin's objectives. I think he probably does quite fancy nibbling at Lithuania, if not taking it. Okay? I'm perfectly alive to the possibility of a conflict with Russia and Poland. The difference being, of course, those countries are NATO members. Ukraine isn't. So we have to have red lines here. If a NATO member is attacked, we're in a military alliance with those countries. Yes, you have collective defense. And if America isn't going to be part of NATO, that's going to have to be a European defense mechanism. That's where I stand on Ukraine. And this has been the problem for the last several years. Of course, it's a grey zone. It's a grey area. In terms of the reality of where we are in 2025, I do kind of agree with you. I think it's a serious red line to have UK and French troops in Ukraine. A serious, serious, serious red line. And as much as I'm very skeptical of, infinity aid going to Ukraine, I am skeptical of that because there's no point continuing a war when the objectives of the Ukrainian state aren't going anywhere. That makes much more sense than committing personnel and potentially becoming embroiled in a conflict. And people might say he's catastrophizing, he's wrong. How do you think the First and Second World War started? We entered the First World War because the neutrality of Belgium was compromised. That's technically the reason why. Why do you think the Second World War starts? Hitler invades Poland. I think, the 1st of August, 1st of September, 1939. And then, of course, we've got a collective security agreement with the Poles. And Hitler, by the way, didn't think that Britain would get involved in a war because of Poland. He was wrong. So these kinds of miscalculations lead to almost incomprehensible suffering. It doesn't mean Hitler's a good guy. It doesn't mean he's rational, evil psychopath, highly irrational, as their little jaunt and Operation Barbarossa into the Soviet Union proved. Highly irrational. But you have to have, I think, clear, precise red lines. And you cannot discard the possibility of this becoming a genuine regional or global war because it's very similar to situations in the past. Now, people might say, well, the Second World War was justified. It was a good war. It was a justified war. By the way, we didn't enter to stop the Holocaust. We entered an important just war for the wrong reasons, one might argue, or we entered too early. Because Britain, again, in 1939, Britain wasn't prepared to win a war with Germany. It wasn't. As you see, by the way, with the first 18 months of that conflict, with Dunkirk. France wasn't prepared to fight that war and win, okay? Britain's able to win that war because of the entry of the US, and of course there's significant amounts of aid given to it and finance given to it, and Germany's invasion of Russia. That's how ultimately the Second World War is won. But Britain wasn't in a position to win that war. So Second World War, which of course is this template that everybody refers to, was a very important just conflict, which we enter for actually quite different reasons. The First World War, Michael, was a catastrophe for the entirety of Europe. It is one of the biggest mistakes humanity has ever made. So this idea that every major war where tens of millions die is justified is complete nonsense. The First World War was completely avoidable, completely stupid, didn't help anybody. And actually, you could argue that after the Germans and the French, the biggest loser was the UK. The UK was smashed by the First World War in terms of its prestige, its economy, etc. It was the beginning of the end for the Brits. So I think these are things that we need to be taken seriously. And let's have a conversation about defence 2.5 or 3% of GDP. I've got my own views on this, but I understand why people want to remilitarise. I understand. My question would be, well, if you think European land war is such a big threat, why on earth do we have 2 aircraft carriers? Why is our entire military built to be the junior partner to the US when the US is saying we don't want to be in Europe anymore? That doesn't make any sense to me. Let's have those conversations, serious conversations.
Let's move on to another element of this story. The acceleration of talks on the European side was obviously prompted, as you know, by the disastrous meeting between Trump and Zelensky in the White House on Friday. What Zelensky should do next has become a point of contention, and Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, formerly a staunch supporter of Ukraine, said this following the White House brawl.
So I think the relationship between Ukraine and America is important, vitally important. But can Zelensky do a deal with the United States? After what I saw, I don't know. He either needs to resign and send somebody over that we can do business with, or he needs to change.
On Sunday, Zelensky was asked to respond to that.
I can give him the citizenship of Ukraine. He will become the citizen of our country, and then his voice will start to gain weight, and I will hear him as a citizen of Ukraine on the topic of who must be the president. But Lindsay represents the party that fights for democratic values, and anyway, the president of Ukraine will have to be chosen not at home, at Lindsay's home, but in Ukraine.
So Zelensky in general has been sounding fairly defiant, actually, when it comes to Donald Trump and the United States. Elsewhere in that press conference, we just showed you a clip of, Zelensky made clear he won't support a ceasefire without first getting security guarantees. And he said a deal with Russia is still very, very far away. Now that appears to have further infuriated Donald Trump, who posted this today on Truth Social. This is the worst statement that could have been made by Zelensky, and America will not put up with it for much longer. It is what I was saying. This guy doesn't want there to be peace as long as he has America's backing. And Europe, in the meeting they had with Zelensky, stated flatly that they cannot do the job without the US. Probably not a great statement to have made in terms of a show of strength against Russia. What are they thinking? Now, obviously, there's sort of a couple of ways you can think about this statement from Donald Trump. Now, the one is to say, all he wants, he's doing Putin's bidding, right? This is just Donald Trump trying to create a situation of maximum advantage to Russia. The other is, if you take him at his word on this, and I'm not necessarily saying you should, but it's an option, right? It seems more plausible than trying to pressure him into providing security guarantees he doesn't want to pressure. But if you take him at his word, then you can say he thinks Ukraine is far away. It's not in America's vital interest, and it doesn't want to take a military role that could draw it into a war with Russia. So it's not going to provide military guarantees, right? And if America is not going to provide military guarantees, then having Ukraine and all the European powers keep repeating, we will provide boots on the ground with American support. He said you're not going to get American support, so maybe it's time to think about a plan B, right? They seem to think that they can keep just repeating plan A, plan A, plan A, and that will ultimately pressure the United States to get involved. It's not clear that's going to happen. They might need a plan B. I've suggested that could be an agreement to continue to fund weapons for Ukraine so that they're a more spiky porcupine. I don't know, we'll see. Let's end the section by looking at one other character who weighed in this weekend.
We need a very radical reset, as you say in the caption behind you. And the reset has to consist of the United States and Ukraine getting back on the same page, and President Zelensky giving his unequivocal backing to the initiative that President Trump is taking to end the war and to bring a just and lasting peace to Ukraine. And the Europeans, George, too, they need to back the calls for a ceasefire. And by the way, I think that Ukraine should be the first to commit to a ceasefire and defy the Russians to follow.
And that was Peter Mandelson, obviously the new UK ambassador to the United States, saying Ukraine should immediately agree to a ceasefire before Russia, presumably before they get any security guarantees, right? That seemed to many to be at odds with the official UK government position. And this morning, a government minister confirmed Mandelson's Ukraine comments were, quote, not government policy. Aaron, he hasn't been in the job very long. He's already freelancing.
Good old Peter. I mean, he's meant to be a diplomat, Peter Mandelson, not a provocateur. He's saying things which are amenable, obviously, to the Trump White House, which is understandable because he's the US ambassador or the UK ambassador to the US. It's one thing to say it privately, it's another thing to say it publicly, or even to brief it. You'd understand. Sources close to the British ambassador say that he thinks this, but to say it on live television is kind of crazy, unless he's trying to bounce his UK colleagues into something, or maybe these are the conversations that are being had at number 10, and he's just simply disclosing them in a public arena. I don't think he's saying it for no reason. I think there's probably a motivation. There always is with Peter Mandelson in saying that. So I suspect it's one of two things. Either it's Starmer's unofficial position rather, or he's saying it so that it becomes Starmer's official position, and he reflects a certain body of opinion within Starmer's inner circle. I presume people like Tony Blair. It is a very realistic position, by the way. You don't have to like it. I don't think it would necessarily work. The idea of unilateral ceasefires don't really make much sense, do they? Stop firing, I promise the other guys will follow. But it's realistic in so much as it will get Trump on side. And I think right now the task for the Europeans, Michael, is some kind of minimal involvement from the US. If the US completely withdraws, zero military aid to Ukraine, zero military backstop, it's over. That's what it boils down to. And I really want to impress this on our viewers and our listeners. It's over. It's finished. You'll see a collapse of what's going on. Now, I understand it's a war of attrition right now in Ukraine, but this is how wars of attrition end, right? You get a complete collapse of one side. We saw that in the First World War. That's very common. So just because it's a war of attrition and you have thousands of people dying just to take up 100 meters, that isn't necessarily indicative of how things end. And I think the Europeans know that. They're very desperate. And it's really interesting watching the media coverage of all of this, Michael, that you don't really have anybody stating that publicly. No, the stakes here potentially are a complete collapse of one side. And if the US leaves and Zelensky and the Ukrainians take any kind of offer. Of course, the American rationale is, well, that necessarily means the Ukrainians will take an offer. I think that's almost certainly true. If they don't, that's the alternative. So you can see why Mandelson's saying what he's saying, but yeah, it's Peter Mandelson being Peter Mandelson, Michael. He likes being political. He likes setting the agenda. Of course, when you're an ambassador, you're not meant to do that.
Let's go on to our next story. We'll obviously be talking about this a lot this week. Germany's Democratic Socialist Party, Die Linke, or the left in English, doubled their vote share in last week's federal election, winning around 9% of the popular vote. That means they now hold 64 seats in Germany's parliament. That's a little more than 10% of the total. Earlier today, my colleague Stephen Meffen was joined by the party's co-leader, Ines Schwerdtner, to discuss that result. But given that European leaders are now scrambling to formulate a defense agreement in the wake of the Ukraine war and US President Donald Trump's reorientation towards Russia, he began by asking Ines about her party's position on European security.
We had just had a meeting also with our party leadership this weekend at the same time. And we were always for peace negotiations and diplomacy in this war. And I think the situation just shows how much Europe and also Germany just missed out on that. 3 years too late. Now we're asking ourselves, what is the European initiative? I think it just comes too late because it was crystal clear before Trump was president that he would probably pull out of this war. And he did so now in a very, frank manner. But we knew before that Putin is an imperialist who wants to get on with this war. And also that, Trump wants, what we know now, wants resources from Ukraine. So I think Europe must take a stronger stance, but rather for diplomacy and not to become like an imperial power itself.
Yeah, on that question of an imperial power, I was looking at your 2021 campaign and your position on European security then. And I wondered what you thought of that view in retrospect. So as I understand it, the position then was demilitarization broadly, the removal of NATO bases from German soil, if not all of Europe, and a kind of European security pact that would involve Russia. Looking back, what do you make of that policy now?
We were right about NATO in a sense that, as you can see, Europe should not only belong to the US. As you can see, we cannot really rely on that. Also, a European defense strategy, I think, is in order still. But obviously, our stance towards Russia has changed. So I think what we need is still a European defense architecture, but that is not based on military power, but on, negotiations and defense, and not to be able to actually attack other countries. I think this is a difference that we still make. And I think when it comes to an architecture that involves Russia, that will probably be in only 10, 20, 30 years of time. So I think that the Ukraine war is a major setback in that kind of architecture. But Russia will still be on the map, even in 20 years. So that's why we're still hanging on to this.
Ines, Die Linke had a pretty amazing result in the recent federal elections in Germany. In 2021, the party did very, very poorly, and then it was followed by splits that, for many in the media in Germany looked like an extinction event for Die Linke. And yet you've now come back with 8% of the vote, very substantial presence in parliament. How do you diagnose that success? What changed? What happened?
Well, the German media thought we were dead after the split because BSW seemed to be very strong, and they had a very strong and, what I say, regressive migration policy. And so we lost in some of the elections, in the European election and in the elections in Eastern Germany. And when Jan van Aken and I, when we became leaders of Die Linke, we decided to focus back on social equality, so on the issues that people are interested most. And we used a method, I think, which you know in the UK as well, which was like major and massive canvassing. So we went to thousands of people, knocked on their doors, asked them, what is your priority? What are your issues right now? And what came out was rent and high prices, so inflation, still minding people's, still being on people's minds. So we made that, the core of our campaign. So we campaigned around social equality most, and we still went on canvassing. We went to, I think, 630,000 doors. We were knocking them. And we had thousands of activists being, really, really active and mobilized. So while the other parties talked about migration, we kept on talking about social issues. And also we worked as a team. So what people did not think we would be able to after the split, we worked as a team better than ever before. So we used all our resources to win direct mandates and to also be really clear on class struggle on social media. And I think all of that together worked really well. So the strategy went really well. And also, we were lucky that the other parties made mistakes, in the sense that the Social Democrats and the Greens really made a lot of room by being too, not opposing the Christian Democrats enough. And at a moment, 2 weeks before the election, when the Christian Democrats worked together with the right-wing AfD, we were the only real opposition in parliament. And I think people saw that and thought, okay, we need a real firewall against, the fascists, and only Die Linke could be that opposition. So we also gained from that. But I think it was a mixture of our own strategy and the circumstances around us.
The circumstances under which these elections took place were particularly difficult when it came to migration, because there were two large-scale attacks in Germany in the months leading up to the election. And I think, except for Die Linke, all of the parties have moved to a migrant-skeptical or anti-migrant position. How do you tackle that sense of anti-migrant feeling in Germany, which is clearly growing, or do you tackle it?
Yeah, that's what I meant when we were the only real firewall against the right, because Social Democrats and Greens were basically bowing down to the Conservatives, saying, yes, we need stronger border controls, for example. And we were always saying, you cannot control the whole border of Germany, first of all. And second of all, it doesn't solve any social issue that we have. We do defend the right to asylum, and we're the only party now that actually does that. We do that in a very offensive way, because we say people are fleeing from wars, and what we need to do is stop the wars and help the refugees that come here. And also, 20% of the people living in Germany are migrants or have a background coming from another place. And I think this is like one third of the population in Germany, and we do need a way of finding work and a place for them to be here, to live in, and just in social society, all of us. And I think we're the only party who has this kind of vision that we can do that. But all we need is the resources to do that. And this is when it comes to the discussion we have now with the debt break and with, resources for infrastructure, for schools, for like teachers and all of that. Because austerity politics in Germany, as you know, is like we are like the root of the problem in all over Europe. But yes, we have it in our own country. And so I think the other parties use migration and say this is the mother of all problems. And we always say it's not migration, it is the mother of all problems, but that our cities and our districts, we don't have enough money to spend on infrastructure and all we need on a daily basis. So we're trying to move the field from migration to social policies.
The German left has often seemed to isolate itself from the wider left on its position on Palestine. And in the context of Gaza, I wonder if you could just lay out what Die Linke's position is on that war, on that genocide, and on Palestinian self-determination in general.
On our last party convention, we talked about it intensively, that we don't allow double standards, not in this war, but not in any war. And that is to say, we say that if someone like Putin is a war criminal, and if he comes to Germany, we will definitely take him into prison. It's the same with Netanyahu. If he commits war crimes, which I think he does, there is a court that rules out on that, then if he comes to Germany, which he might do in a couple of days because Friedrich Merz invited him, then actually he would get into prison. And I think it's important to say that we are the party that relies on human rights and on basic rights and on international law, first of all, and that we always take the stance of victims in this war. And that goes for Ukraine in the same like the war in Gaza. So we defend the rights of the people and also the two-state solution and to have a Palestinian state. And I know this is, something, and especially in the German left, that is debated on a very, very emotional manner because of the German history, which everyone knows. But I think our party convention last October was very clear on that. And we act on that on a daily basis, even if some people might, say something else, but I think our position is very clear on that.
That was part of a longer interview. We'll be putting out the full version tomorrow, so look out for that on our YouTube channel. In that interview, Stephen mentioned the two deadly car attacks that happened in Germany before the election, one in Magdeburg and the other in Munich. The suspect in each attack was a refugee living in Germany from a majority Muslim country. So that very much sort of played towards the AfD during the election. Hours after that interview, there was another car attack in Germany, this time in the city of Mannheim. 2 people have been reported killed in the attack. An arrest has also been made. The suspect has been described as a 40-year-old German man without a migration background. No motive has yet been attributed by the police. The first phase of the Gaza ceasefire expired on Saturday, but instead of proceeding to the second phase of the deal agreed by both Hamas and Israel in January, Israel is trying to change the terms. This was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaking on Sunday.
Israel has accepted President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff's plan to extend the temporary ceasefire by 50 days. During that time, we can discuss the conditions for a permanent ceasefire that will end the war in Gaza. In Witkoff's plan, half of the hostages would be released right away, and the remaining half would be released if we reach an agreement on a permanent ceasefire. Again, Israel has accepted this plan, I accepted this plan, but so far, Hamas has rejected it.
Negotiations on phase 2 of the ceasefire were supposed to have started weeks ago, but things fell apart when US President Donald Trump announced his plan for the US to occupy and redevelop the Gaza Strip. That proposal involved the ethnic cleansing of nearly 2 million Palestinians from the enclave, relocating them to smaller sites in other Arab states like Jordan and Egypt. And now Hamas has said that Israel is trying to push peace negotiations back to square one. The group has said they'd be willing to accept a 50-day extension to phase 1 of the ceasefire agreement, but only in exchange for guarantees that phase 2 would take place afterwards. So far, neither the US nor Israel has made that guarantee. And you can see why Palestinians might be suspicious of any proposal without one, when the United States, one of the guarantors of the original ceasefire, has pitched a plan, in Trump's words, to own Gaza. In response to the deadlock, Israel has now imposed a fresh blockade on Gaza to try and force Hamas's hand. Trucks carrying humanitarian aid and food supplies have once again been blocked from entering Gaza, with queues of vehicles now forming at the enclave's Rafah border crossing with Egypt. Responding to the blockade, a Hamas spokesperson said this: Netanyahu's decision to stop aid going into Gaza once again shows the ugly face of the Israeli occupation. The international community must apply pressure on the Israeli government to stop starving our people. Responses to Israel's blockade have begun to pour in from the international community. Qatar and Egypt are mediating the ceasefire negotiations, and both have criticized Israel's tactics. Egypt's foreign ministry has accused Israel of using starvation as a weapon against the Palestinian people. Meanwhile, Qatar has said it strongly condemns the Israeli decision, calling it a clear violation of the ceasefire agreement and international humanitarian law. And the UN's head of relief, Tom Fletcher, posted this online. Israel's decision to halt aid into Gaza is alarming. International humanitarian law is clear, or we must be allowed access to deliver vital life-saving aid. We can't roll back the progress of the past 42 days. We need to get aid in and the hostages out. The ceasefire must hold. Not all of the international response, though, has been condemnation. Some countries instead chose to reward Israel. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio used an emergency declaration to bypass Congress and approve the transfer of $4 billion worth of arms to Israel. The New York Times reports that package contains 35,000 2,000-pound bombs. That's the kind that flatten entire apartment blocks. It's the second time in a month that Rubio has invoked emergency powers to send arms to Israel without congressional approval. National Security spokesperson Brian Hughes also gave US backing to Israel's blockade, saying this: Israel has negotiated in good faith. That's a joke. Since the beginning of this administration to secure the release of hostages. Given that Hamas has declared it no longer seeks a ceasefire, we will support Israel's decisions regarding its next steps. As the Gaza ceasefire deal appears to be falling apart, Arab nations are trying to work out their own response to Trump's all-out support for Israel. Leaders of the Arab League, including Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan, will meet in Cairo for an emergency summit on Tuesday to try to iron out a plan for Gaza's reconstruction. The aim is to counter Trump's Riviera of the Middle East proposal for Gaza, and its success depends on being able to formulate a plan that Israel, Hamas, and the US will all accept. That sounds very difficult. Speaking to Deutsche Welle, Professor of Political Science Nathan Brown said this: if the Arab world were to coalesce behind a specific proposal that says, we will help with reconstruction in Gaza, we will help with normalizing relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, we will help build a region in which this issue is finally put behind us, then it would be very difficult for an American administration not to cooperate with it. But Brown also listed a number of obstacles to such a proposal being agreed, saying this: number one, the American president himself is notoriously unpredictable, and there would still be real objections among the allies of the Israeli right within the American government. Secondly, Israel is an incredible obstacle here. Any kind of Arab initiative that is based on treating the Palestinians as a national entity would have to be strong and somehow able to persuade either Israeli public opinion or the US. Finally, there are internal obstacles. In the Arab world, these countries have never been able to define a strategic goal and pursue it. I find it somewhat implausible, I have to say, that if the Arab states just put a good enough proposal together, the Americans and Israelis would agree to it, because, I mean, the Israelis are still clinging to their sort of desire to ultimately empty Gaza by making it unlivable. And why would they sort of change, or why would they move from that plan when they've got a president who is literally making AI videos showing the outcome they want? So it doesn't seem to me that, if only the Arab states could put together a good proposal, this could be worked out. In the meantime, life in Gaza continues. Israel's fresh blockade comes at the start of the Muslim holy month of Ramadan, which began on Saturday. At sunset, over 5,000 Palestinians gathered to break their fast among the ruins of Rafah. Seated at long tables set up among the rubble, families ate iftar meals provided by volunteers, hoping to bring a sense of normalcy to the holy month. Aaron, I suppose what's really shocking here is every time Israel doesn't get its way, it says, oh, you know what we'll do? Let's starve Gaza. Right? It's sort of like, we want a bit more leverage. Should we just stop the food going in again? Like that just seems to be now just a habitual response from the Israeli government, and collective punishment is a war crime. Right? You can't just say, oh, let's apply a bit more leverage by not letting the food in. Right? That's something that should not be normalized. Obviously, the Americans are going along with it. The UN isn't. But so long as the Americans are going along with it, Israel will presumably get away with it.
It has been normalized. I suppose the point is, once you've committed war crimes, you've undertaken collective punishment, as Israel has basically since the start of this conflict, since October 2023, then I suppose it doesn't matter. There's diminishing returns, right? It's not like Benjamin Netanyahu or the Israeli Defense Secretary or Foreign Secretary. It doesn't feel like if they do something now, then all of a sudden there will be some legal, political punishments that weren't forthcoming previously. Nothing's happened and all the disincentives have simply disappeared. This was also raised, by the way, earlier on in the House of Commons, and Keir Starmer said this is not appropriate, it's not acceptable. What are the consequences? And the same politicians in this country will say this is not acceptable, you can't do it. These are, war crimes, or this is collective punishment. I think probably even Keir Starmer would accept that as collective punishment. They then say that, BDS is bad, or that actually we shouldn't necessarily respect arrest warrants for Israeli politicians who are culpable for war crimes. So, yes, you're right. It feels like there are no consequences now. And it feels like there are no consequences because there have been no consequences. I mean, I'm curious, I'll throw it back to you, Michael. What are the disincentives now for Netanyahu to not just do this in Gaza, and increasingly, by the way, the West Bank? This seems now like the next strategic step by the Israelis to turn the West Bank effectively into Gaza, slowly but surely, ahead of, I think, a form of annexation. But what are the disincentives to do the precise same thing in Syria? What are the disincentives to do the precise same thing in Lebanon? I don't see them, frankly.
I would imagine that the international response might be a bit stronger if they went into Syria or Lebanon. I mean, sort of Gaza has been considered kind of an exceptional zone by much of the world for a very long time, right? I mean, maybe they could go into Lebanon. I mean, obviously they are in Syria and they are in Lebanon. Would they try and ethnically cleanse either Syria or parts of Lebanon to sort of resettle it with Israelis? I don't know. I hadn't really considered that. I was just looking at an update in The Guardian. They published it sort of 4 minutes after we went live. The headline is, Israel prepares Gaza hell plan to pile pressure on Hamas. So they've come up with a plan which is literally called a hell plan, which involves potentially cutting off electricity to the strip to try to secure more hostage releases. So this is like collective punishment on steroids to the extent that they've literally called it a hell plan. Right? Can you imagine you're at The Hague and you've got the prosecutor saying, and what was the plan called? And like, well, it was called the hell plan, Your Honor. Right? That sounds a lot like collective punishment to me. But obviously the Americans are going to go along with it, and that's all the Israelis seem to need. And Britain will say, we disagree with the hell plan, but of course we wouldn't make Israel face any consequences. That would be terrible. So we'll disagree with the hell plan and we'll send them weapons so long as they use the weapons on all the other plans except the hell plan. I imagine that would be the UK position if we were to sort of follow along with our strategy up to now. On Sunday night, the who's who of the Hollywood A-list filed into Los Angeles Dolby Theatre to celebrate the Academy Awards. But amongst all the glamour and the glitz, there was one standout moment. This was Palestinian filmmaker Basil Adra accepting his Best Documentary Oscar for the film No Other Land.
Thank you to the Academy for the award. It's such a big honor for the four of us and everybody supported us for this documentary. About 2 months ago, I became a father, and my hope to my daughter that she will not have to live the same life I'm living now, always fearing settlers' violence, home demolitions, and forest spill displacements that my community, Masafir Yatta, is living and facing every day under the Israeli occupation. No other land reflect the harsh reality that we have been enduring for decades and still persist as we call on the world to take serious actions to stop the injustice and to stop the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people.
Basil Adra, along with one of his co-directors, Hamdan Balal, are now the first Palestinians ever to win an Academy Award. No Other Land was made by a 4-person collective of pro-Palestinian activists, which also included Jewish Israelis, Yuval Abraham and Rachel Saw. The film traces the forced displacement of Palestinians from Astra's home region of Masafir Yatta in the occupied West Bank. But it's also a record of the friendship he formed with journalist Abraham. Yuval Abraham has frequently written for Israeli left-wing magazine 972 throughout the war on Gaza. We've covered a number of his pieces on this show. They include this investigation into Israel's Lavender AI targeting system used to mark out tens of thousands of Palestinians for remote assassination by drones and bombs. In his acceptance speech for the Oscar, Abraham drew attention to the gulf between Palestinian and Israeli lives.
We made this film, Palestinians and Israelis, because together our voices are stronger, We see each other, the atrocious destruction of Gaza and its people, which must end, the Israeli hostages brutally taken in the crime of October 7th, which must be freed. When I look at Bassel, I see my brother, but we are unequal. We live in a regime where I am free under civilian law, and Bassel is under military laws that destroy his life and he cannot control. There is a different path, a political solution without ethnic supremacy, with national rights for both of our people. And I have to say, as I am here, the foreign policy in this country is helping to block this path. And, you know, why? Can't you see that we are intertwined? That my people can be truly safe if Bassel's people are truly free and safe? There is another way.
Not everyone was celebrating that Oscar win, least of all the Israeli government. Israel's Minister of Culture, Miki Zohar, posted this online in response. The Oscar win for the film No Other Land is a sad moment for the world of cinema. Instead of presenting the complexity of Israeli reality, the filmmakers chose to amplify narratives that distort Israel's image vis-a-vis international audiences. Freedom of expression is an important value, but turning the defamation of Israel into a tool for international promotion is not art. It is sabotage against the state of Israel, especially in the wake of the October 7th massacre and the ongoing war. This is precisely why we passed a reform in state-funded cinema to ensure that taxpayer money is directed towards works of art that speak to the Israeli audience, rather than an industry that builds its career on slandering Israel on the global stage. So clearly, any kind of state-funded cinema in Israel cannot tell the truth that Israel is an apartheid state. No Other Land may now be an Oscar-winning documentary, but Israeli cinemas refused to screen it. Instead, the four filmmakers made it free to view online for Israeli and Palestinian audiences. But for some reason, it's still pretty difficult to see the film if you're in the United States. Just days before its directors took home the Academy Awards, IndieWire reported that the film still didn't have a US distributor, despite being the highest-grossing Oscar-nominated documentary this year. So this Oscar-winning film still doesn't have a distributor. I'm pretty sure in the UK it's now available via Channel 4. I think Channel 4 are distributing it. Aaron, powerful speeches there.
They were, yeah. Well, specifically, I think the speech made by the Israeli. I mean, that's a nightmare for an Israeli politician. And going back to the chap you just mentioned a moment ago, Miki Zohar, great quote from 2018, or not so great. He stated in a radio debate that the entire Jewish race is the highest human capital, the smartest, the most comprehending. We are dealing here with racial supremacists, and that is why he can't even accept the basic possibility of freedom of artistic expression and the ability to criticize the state of Israel. You know, it is deeply ironic. It would almost be funny if people, including, by the way, newborn children, were dying. It would almost be funny that people who represent a state which talks about the hell plan proceed to say that anything which is critical of them is slander. You know, well, literally just look at the title of the military operations you guys are heading up, and it's all you need to know.
Former EastEnders star Danny Dyer was at the Brit Awards, sitting next to a DJ dressed as a horse, and this happened.
If we were giving out a Brit Award for your Twat of the Year, who would win the Danny Dyer Bell End Door?
Well, there's so many. Let's have it right. The world is being run by cranks at the moment, so probably Keir Starmer.
Okay. Right. Let's not turn this into a riot. Okay. Time now to go for a break, but still to come. We're going to get a little bit.
Now we're showing you that sort of version that was filmed in the stadium and uploaded to TikTok because it was cut from the broadcast version. Now I'm not sure that was, political censorship, or it was just before that bit that we showed you, Danny Dyer had said the rudest word one can say that begins with C and rhymes with hunt. So that might be why it didn't get shown on ITV. But anyway, Danny Dyer's reasons for choosing Keir Starmer as his Twat of the Year weren't made clear there, but he did say more in an interview with The Big Issue in October last year. The Tories are such fucking arseholes that Keir Starmer got in, not for what Labour was saying, but because the Tories fucked it up so much. And I don't like this man. I don't trust this man. He got the job handed to him on a plate. So what are you going to do to show us you're different? And he's gone straight in on pensioners. I find that fucking fascinating. This is meant to be a working class party We need more working class people in politics. Why Angela Rayner's not leading things, I don't know. When she speaks, I listen. Aaron, it wasn't as memorable a clip as when he called David Cameron twat, putting his trotters up. But still, will that cut deep in number 10?
Probably not. When you're in power, it's just part of the job that people are going to take pops at you. But it's interesting, he talks about the pensioners. And I think about this actually, Michael, in the last couple of days, what with the significant increase to defence spending, you can think it's justified. That's fine. To 3% by the early 2030s, that's a really major increase. It's the biggest increase in defence spending since the Cold War. And none of this was in the Labour Party manifesto. None of this was in the Labour Party manifesto. I think to finance that, ultimately, we will also have to see more tax rises. I think that's inevitable, actually. Again, wasn't in the manifesto. Hike on national insurance contributions for employers comes in April. Wasn't in the manifesto. Well, that's not a tax on employees. Well, it means that employees won't get their wages increased. So it kind of is. I think it's inarguable the guy lies a lot, right? He conceals a lot. And we've got 4 more years of it. And I think people watching or listening will say, I don't know, but the Tories are worse. I mean, that's probably true. We can perhaps do better, though, in terms of political choices than the abject disgrace of the Conservatives between 2010 and 2024, and somebody who literally time after time after time seems to only enact policies, with some exceptions, which actually weren't talked about in his manifesto. I think long-term, that's really going to erode and undermine people's basic confidence in democracy. And when you have stagnating living standards, things aren't being addressed, problems aren't being solved, and you have politicians who are synonymous with not actually doing the things they say they're going to do and, actually doing completely different stuff than is in their party manifestos and what they talk about ahead of elections. I think that's a really toxic mix.
I mean, obviously, he's hoping that living standards will be rising at some point during his premiership. Otherwise, it's all over. Let's wrap up there. Aaron Bastani, pleasure to be joined by you on a Monday evening.
My pleasure, Michael. Love talking to you.
Aaron will be in this chair tomorrow, so do tune in at 6 p.m. Until then, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.